Welcome, everybody. Welcome. So good to have you all here. I'm delighted to welcome you to tonight's program, Researching Building Ghosts, here at the Historical Society of Pennsylvania. My name is Justina Barrett. I'm the Chief Learning and Engagement Officer here, and it's so good to have you here on site at 13th and Locust in Philadelphia, and with us wherever you're zooming in from. We're delighted you could join us. HSP was founded in 1824. We just came off of our 200th birthday, and we proudly serve as Philadelphia's Library of American History. We have over 21 million manuscripts, books, and graphic items that tell the stories of all Americans. We have particular strengths in early American collections, ethnic and minority histories, the arts, science and technology, and genealogical resources. A little bit of housekeeping before we get started. We are in hybrid mode, so folks in the room, we are on Zoom, and for you at home on Zoom, we welcome you. We are in webinar mode, so we cannot see you and you cannot see each other. We do ask if you want closed captioning. We have that. You can hit the CC button. And for everybody's information, we are recording tonight's talk, and we'll be sending it out to you in a follow-up email from Zoom tomorrow night, so you can share it and relive tonight's glory as much as we enjoy that. We will have time for questions at the end, both in the room and on Zoom. Folks on Zoom, you can go ahead and use the Q&A box and put them in that box throughout as you think about them. And myself and Selena Austin, who is on Zoom, will be handling that Q&A at the end. So tonight we welcome Molly Lester and Michael Bixler, the authors of Building Ghosts, Past Lives and Lost Places in a Changing City. It's a gorgeously produced book for those of you in the room. We're having it for sale here, about the architectural remnants that are left behind when buildings are demolished. What can these ghosts tell us about our shifting and evolving neighborhoods? I'm delighted to host this talk here at HSP because many of our collections can serve the type of research that Molly and Michael will be sharing here tonight. We have architectural drawings, we have many atlases, we have many maps, including the Sanborn maps. We have fire insurance policies going back to the 1780s, from the contribution ship, from Mutual Assurance, from Franklin Fire Company, Pennsylvania Fire Company. Visual collections such as the Penrose Pictorial Philadelphia collections, Campbell scrapbooks, which also are organized by street and neighborhood, and the photo morgue of the newspaper, The Philadelphia Record, which has amazing photographs from the mid-20th century. All these resources are listed in our Architectural Resources Subject Guide, which is available online, so you can start getting started on some of that research. And we hope you make an appointment to come down to our reading room and start looking at some of these things through for your own curiosities about your neighborhoods and your buildings. Okay, so let's get to our speakers. Thank you for that. Plug for HSP's amazing collections. Molly Lester is a historian of the built environment and currently serves as the Associate Director of the Urban Heritage Project at the University of Pennsylvania's Weitzman School of Design. Her research interests include the ephemeral traces of building ghosts in the built environment and the role of women in shaping the American built environment in the 19th and early 20th centuries, with particular focus on architect Minerva Parker Nichols and the she camps of the New Deal. She is the author of Building Ghosts, as well as the co-author of Minerva Parker Nichols, The Search for a Forgotten Architect, which was also published in 2024. So good to have you, Molly. And Michael Bixler is the editorial director and chief photographer of Hidden City, Philadelphia. His writing and photography is focused on creating dialogue and documentation of the built environment and how it relates to history, culture, and the urban experience. Mr. Bixler is the photographer of Building Ghosts, Past Lives, and Lost Places. So Molly, you'll be up first, Michael will speak, and then Molly will come back, and we will have questions at the end. Thanks so much. Let's get started.
Right. You can hear me on Zoom? All right. Thank you for those of you who made the trek out on a cold, cold night. In 2013, I was wandering with a friend through Northern Liberties We strolled up North 2nd Street, sidling up alongside the broad Baroque front of St. Michael's Church and the brick buildings that flank it. The parish is an undeniably monumental presence in the neighborhood, and yet it was a different pile of bricks that caught my eye just beyond the church. This isn't. There we go. That was the pile of bricks I was thinking of. In a vacant lot at a quiet intersection, an unassuming heap of blocks foregrounded and were clearly responsible for a building ghost at the edge of the parcel. I'd lived in Philadelphia for several years at this point, and I'm sure it wasn't the first ghost that I ever passed, but it was the first one I saw. A stair that snaked its way up the wall, the outline of a former foyer, a series of lines in the attic gable clearly left over from a set of shelves. The ghost mesmerized me, just as my first college course in architectural history had done several years before when I first fell in love with the history of old buildings and cultural landscapes. But where my coursework and jobs to this point had mostly focused on grand structures with unquestioned significance, this building ghost of a modest row house claimed a different sort of authority. As everyone in this room knows, when you live in an old place like Philadelphia, lavish buildings such as St. Michael's Church may be accents in the streetscape, sparking a thrill when you encounter them, but it's the commonplace buildings such as this erstwhile row house that actually define the everyday. I wanted to know more about this utterly mundane building that had been there, to draw on all the same detective skills that I need for my higher profile research subjects, but deploy them for a building with no name or famous residents. But in the weeks that followed, I somehow lost the ghost. I went back to Northern Liberties alone, wandering in search of the exposed wall that I had stood in front of so recently. I couldn't orient myself, and there were no empty lots to be found as I radiated out from the starting point of the church. Belatedly, I realized that the active construction site at 2nd and Jefferson Streets and my empty lot were one and the same. The building ghost was no longer visible as a new structure rose to take its place. It was an unfortunate lesson about the nature of building ghosts, which may vanish as quickly as they once materialized. In the years that followed, I researched the former ghost anyway and wrote a piece about its idiosyncratic history for Hidden City Philadelphia, of which Michael is the managing editor. Various work projects took me to every corner of the city, and I documented other building ghosts as I found them, having learned my lesson about trying to return later to a building ghost. I started noticing patterns. What kinds of buildings become ghosts? How long the ghosts last? Where ghosts do and do not occur in the broad reaches of the city. I started an Instagram account to chronicle my ghostly wanderings and found that plenty of friends and strangers were fascinated by them too. Among them was Michael Bixler, the photographer for this book. He would send me photos of ghosts from his own travels, photos that were much more artful and crisp than my own, hooked with the same curiosity that I shared. Eventually, I decided to explore this passion project with more rigor, and I enlisted him and his photographic expertise. I applied for funding from the Sachs Program for Arts Innovation at Penn and received a seed grant in early 2020. When the world shut down in the face of the COVID pandemic, I took solace in dreaming about the project that would take shape when we could venture out again. Confined to my house and immediate vicinity, I missed my city. I went months without seeing neighborhoods and people that I loved. As many of us hunkered down, building ghosts became emblematic for me of the moment in which we found ourselves. Suspended in time, they symbolized some inherent measure of loss and absence. Finally, in fall 2020, Michael and I launched the project that would become this book. Hungry for exploration, we trekked all over Philadelphia in our spare time in search of ghosts. For all the pain of that period of 2020, there was something appropriate about embarking on this venture in that moment. The pandemic reframed so many aspects of our lives, and building ghosts wield a similar power, forcing a re-examination of their context. They have a way of making even familiar places look strange, exposing a rift between what we think we remember of a building and what we see after it's gone. This book exists in that uncertain interlude, dwelling on these lost buildings and found ghosts as an invitation to see the city around us in a new way. So what are we talking about when we talk about building ghosts? Building ghosts are the imprint and last impressions of a demolished building left behind on the walls of the neighboring structures. Physically, they are architectural remnants that can only be found in a row house city such as Philadelphia, where the loss of one structure leaves a tangible mark on its neighbors. These ghosts can be ephemeral or enduring, quickly revealed and replaced in a neighborhood seeing rapid change, or unveiled and exposed indefinitely in a neighborhood that hasn't seen new construction in a long time. In the simplest sense, these ghosts are artistic objects, beautiful, sometimes legible, and confounding all at once. But these vestiges of structures, stairs, wallpaper, closets are also legacies, hinting at the lives lived within these walls, the communities shaped around these buildings, and the ways in which we create and erase history in our changing cities. Our book investigates, mourns, and celebrates these ghosts in our midst, retracing their structures and selves, and dwelling in the moment between a place's loss and its erasure. We should begin by defining our terms, beginning with the choice to refer to this type of remnant as a building ghost rather than a ghost building, as it is sometimes known. We didn't coin either term. We've opted to use the former as it places the emphasis on the ghost, as in all the ephemeralities that overlap in these traces, rather than the literalness of just the structure itself. It's important to note that a building ghost is not simply a building that is in the process of being demolished. If that structure does not abut its neighbors, it is not capable of creating a building ghost. A building ghost, or ghost for short, is by definition the trace of that demolished building that remains on the shared party wall of its neighbors, even after it is gone. A building ghost is also distinct from a ghost sign, which I'm sure a lot of you can picture, the paint traces of faded advertisements, which are ubiquitous in many cities with older building stock. The further we got into this project, the more we found that we needed words to define two recurring phenomena related to building ghosts. Thus, we did coin two phrases, beginning with double ghost, which we use to mean a lot in which there is a ghost on both sides, as we found at 333 North 11th Street. In other words, the demolished building was located in the middle of the block, thus its empty parcel features two ghosts rather than one. We needed a second word to describe a ghost whose presence is so long-standing as to suggest permanence. For these situations, we describe them as legacy ghosts. The simplest kind of legacy ghost is one that overlooks an empty lot that remains available for new construction and has been poised that way for some time. I will say Michael will show you some examples of that kind of legacy ghost where it's hovering over an empty lot. This is a different kind of legacy ghost that survives in spite of new construction that might have supplanted it. The ghost of a three-story building might become a legacy ghost if a two-story building is constructed in its place. The legacy ghost, left raw or finished with stucco, the way you see here on Rittenhouse Square, remains visible above or alongside the new structure. Each building ghost is not merely an artistic object unto itself, although many of them create an odd and beautiful sort of art, but a palimpsest of the artists who created the demolished building over generations of people and time. Building ghosts juxtapose the solidity of the wall and the void of the vacant lot left behind, the tangible and the missing, the past and the present, and the pending or suspended future. We look to building ghosts then to point out the voids of people and place, to confront the ghosts we've inherited and the ghosts we've made. Our intention with this book was to turn urban heritage inside out, making a study of the built environment by looking at what is not actually built at all. In doing so, the book starts where most interpretations of architecture stop, the moment a structure is demolished. The project has required a blend of archival research and contemporary photography, but first it required seeing every corner of our city. Together and alone, Michael and I walked, biked, bused, trolleyed, trained, and drove all over the city in 2020, noting every instance of a building ghost that we could find, including several that were crowdsourced by friends and strangers. It would be impossible to count the miles that we covered between the two of us, but the surveyed number was clear: 194 building ghosts observed in 4 months, a fraction of which I show you here. Some existed for mere hours, others, according to older photographs, have been around for decades. Such is the nature of building ghosts. But we mapped every single ghost we found, establishing a timestamp and creating a census, for those 4 months at least. If you tried to find all 194 ghosts today, you would not be able to. Sometimes we couldn't even revisit a ghost from one day to the next. The timestamp of a city's building ghosts refreshes every moment. In mapping these ghosts and the dozens of others that we found, clear patterns started to emerge, where they show up by the dozens and where they are not present at all. I will just divert to say, even the sections of the city that you think we might not have actually gotten to, like Northwest and Northeast Philly, I promise you that we did. That's part of the story here. They offer tangible traces of the intangible themes of community history, demolition, dislocation, and neighborhood change. Conscious of those implications, I reconstructed the history of 40 of those ghosts. These vignettes, a few of which I'll share today, are stories, but they are not fiction. Some recount the full trajectory of the building from construction to demolition, while others salvage only a fragment of a building's existence. All of them, however, rely on extensive research of the sort that Justina described in deeds, censuses, city directories, insurance maps, newspapers, genealogical records, aerial photographs, books, magazines, and in the rarest instances, historical images. No matter how many stones I turned, though, the vignettes are inescapably incomplete, as is the encounter with any building ghost. Our census found that ghosts existed in most neighborhoods, but they were not the same in every neighborhood. When it comes to building ghosts, not all communities are created or destroyed equally. For this reason, the book is organized geographically into 7 sections, but it is weighted proportionally. For city sections with more surveyed ghosts, like North Philadelphia, which you can tell from the map, we've included more ghosts in the book. For those with hardly a ghost for miles, our selections reflect that reality. Building ghosts offer many such realities to reflect on and reckon with. Thus, each section of the book begins with an essay provoked by, but certainly not exclusive to, the ghosts in that section of the city. Recognizing where we are today, I'll share the essay associated with Center City in a moment. These reflections grapple with the present-day resonances of building ghosts and what they might reveal about how cities evolve. Where the vignettes dwell on individual ghosts, the essays examine the connections among many ghosts. The vignettes address the more distant past, and the essays consider the present and near future tense. Building ghosts and our book about them are thus stitched together across space and time. I'm going to pass the mic to Michael to talk about his process and the photography that is the core of this book as well.
So our book is all about context. For Molly's detailed research. Uh-oh. Still doing it. Okay. All right, let's give it one more shot. This is funny. Every reading we have, the microphone doesn't like me, and I'm convinced that there are ghosts in these microphones. Maybe I'll just stand back here. So our book is all about context. For Molly's detailed research to her pursuit of instructive, timely themes supported by hard data. For my part, it was important that the photographs both respond in direct conversation with her text, while at the same time tell a story of their own through visual context that puts the viewer into the scene. I set out to document the remains of wallpaper, staircases, floor joists, the quintessential elements of building ghosts. But I also sought to capture more, like entire adjacent buildings, spans of intact row houses, and the streetscape of featured neighborhoods for nuanced urban context. I often found that construction equipment, bowing facades, bent street signs, graffiti, and even bags of trash and piles of debris were just as important to include in the frame as the building ghosts themselves. This was a way to bring the historical narratives and sociological observations full circle. So for a book centered on the lives of people, you may notice that there are not many people in the photographs. Part of this was a byproduct of the pandemic, but there was also some intention at play. We began our photo documentation process in September 2020 as COVID-19 infections were still raging and the CDC continued to urge the public to continue social distancing. While commercial and construction activity had resumed, there was a lingering desolation in many parts of the city. Schools were still closed and people were largely staying indoors still. This made it easier to focus on the building ghost locations at hand. With the absence of people and the distraction of dodging moving cars, which is usual in Philadelphia if you're trying to take a photograph of a building, I was able to connect with our subjects in a more concentrated and meaningful way. I focused on dignifying each ghost and their neighboring buildings. In a way, I wanted to treat them with emotional care. When I did come across people taking a walk or sitting with their family on their stoop, we would have great conversations about why I was taking pictures of empty lots. There was a genuine interest in our project, especially in North Philadelphia, where I spent more than a month documenting. After chatting with folks for a while, I would direct them to our Instagram account to follow along with the project or even participate. So there are usually two reasons, as Molly mentioned, for building ghosts to appear. Demolition by way of real estate development, what we call temporary ghosts, and destruction through deferred maintenance, which is typically caused by disinvestment in a neighborhood. These are what we call legacy ghosts. We decided to limit the photo documentation process to 4 months, as Molly mentioned as well. We set a hard, fast rule that I could not go back to rephotograph a location no matter how much I disliked the original, much to my chagrin, but we kept to it. By doing so, we have created a moment frozen in time. In development-heavy neighborhoods, building ghosts are fleeting as new construction fills newly vacant lots, often faster than they are created. In places like North Philadelphia, some building ghosts have been exposed for decades and may remain that way for years to come. So this first set of photographs shows temporary ghosts caused by real estate development. And this first one is at 701 South 19th Street, which is in Graduate Hospital, South Philadelphia. And this was the former headquarters of the Foreign Mission Board, National Baptist Convention, USA, which was founded in 1800 by a group of Black Baptist ministers, a historic building. The building was demolished in 2020 by a developer to make way for a 6-unit mid-rise apartment complex. And this is 1803 Ridge Avenue in Francisville, which is considered lower North Philadelphia. There was originally a cool Flatiron building, probably built early 20th century, that was demolished in 2020 by a developer for a construction of a 5-unit apartment complex. So lots of development all over the city and the neighborhoods if you have your finger on the pulse of development in the predictable places. This is 1826 Frankfurt Avenue in Fishtown. It was demolished by a developer in 2020 to make way for a 4-story, 6-unit condominium complex. And this one is at 1828 Christian Street in Graduate Hospital, South Philadelphia. And that was demolished in 2020 by a developer to make way for a new 4-story row house. And lastly, this is 1830 North 4th Street in Northern Liberties. And it was demolished by the owner in 2018. Unlike the prior locations, the empty lot is still being used, or is still there, just being used as a garden. So kind of segs into what we call legacy ghosts. So this next section is about legacy ghosts. And you'll find a general theme in these. This location is in Strawberry Mansion. It was demolished through the Department of Licenses and Inspections demolition program in 2020. It is currently a vacant, overgrown lot. This one is on Napa Street in Strawberry Mansion in North Philadelphia. It was demolished in 2019 by LNI and is currently a empty lot owned by the city of Philadelphia. So not much investment going on here by the city. This is on Master Street. It was demolished in 2014. It's currently owned by the Philadelphia Housing Authority. And 2023, the Housing Authority demolished the home pictured here at 2242 Master Street, and both parcels are currently vacant lots. This is on Cleveland Street in North Philadelphia. It was demolished in 2017 by L&I. Vacant lot is currently owned by the city. And unfortunately, the home pictured here was also demolished in 2021, and both parcels are currently a vacant lot. And this is a rarity, juxtaposition with the last set on Ridge Avenue and Strawberry Mansion. And it was demolished sometime between 2009 and 2011 by the owner. And in 2024, a developer filed zoning permits with L&I to build a three-unit, three-story structure on the lot. Great. I will hand it back to Molly.
So bringing this back from North Philadelphia to Center City, as I mentioned, the book is organized geographically with neighborhood scale essays that reflect on the contemporary implications of building ghosts and site-specific vignettes. To give you a sense of that essay, the essays that are distributed throughout the book reflecting on each neighborhood, I will speak today about Center City specifically. Center City is a land of fleeting building ghosts. Spot one on a Monday and it might be gone by Wednesday, covered up by scaffolding as a new building races upward. In a city known for its walkable and mixed-use downtown, building ghosts have been the structural fly on the wall to a boom in residents in the past 20 years. Between 2000 and 2020, the population of core Center City surged by 55%, compared with 6% for the city overall during the same period. All of those incoming residents needed places to live and work and socialize, and new construction has usually been presented as the solution to those pressing needs. Amid such churn, building ghosts are inevitable. In 2020, the year the photographs for this book were taken, the number of approved demolition permits fell by half in Philadelphia compared with the previous year. In the face of a pandemic construction shutdown and economic uncertainty, the city's Department of Licenses and Inspections fielded just 54% of the requests that it had in 2019. One surmises then that we would have found twice as many ghosts had we been wandering the streets a year earlier or later. Yet even at the slower pace of demolition, we found dozens of ghosts in Center City in the span of just a few months and missed many more that proved too ephemeral to track down. Indeed, in many ways, 2020 was just a blip in the overall pace of construction and demolition in Center City. By early 2021, the number of new construction permits had not only rebounded, but had surged above pre-pandemic levels, factoring in the pent-up demand and a pending change to the long-established 10-year tax abatement in Philadelphia. More than 20 years after its creation, with investment in Center City surging, many Philadelphians believed the abatement had outstayed its welcome, creating an incentive to tear down old buildings and create a tabula rasa for zoning permits and new designs of varying quality. The abatement does not deserve all the credit or bear all the responsibility for the demolition of many high-profile and substantial sites in the early 21st century, but it did help to generate the development pressure that disproportionately valued new construction over rehabilitation. The demolition of several buildings on Jewelers Row, just a stone's throw from us now and still just a hole in the ground, was probably the most painful and galvanizing loss in recent years. But the flurry of abatement-centric projects exacted a more mundane cost, too, in the scores of smaller scale buildings that were swept up in the financial incentives with little fanfare or outcry. Revealed and recovered at the midpoint of these rapid transitions, building ghosts have been witnesses to and markers of these changes all over Center City. A preservation task force convened by Mayor Jim Kenney released its final report in March 2019. Coupled with the modified 5-year tax break that replaced the 10-year abatement in 2021, the task force's recommendations were designed to balance the scales between adaptive reuse and new construction. Even so, at the time I was writing this book, and even now, the ongoing implementation of the task force's recommendations is up against any number of barriers, including what felt at the time like a passive mayor, a city council focused on other issues in the midst of significant turnover, existing zoning designations that may not take into account the nuances of older buildings, and more. Even bringing this context up to the present, the arena debacle really casts a light on how we treat the disposability of certain places in this city. Some of these conditions can be found in other cities and are responsible for those cities' ghosts too. Others are unique to this place in this moment. As we love to say around here, they're a Philly thing. The now disbanded task force and the associated city agencies responsible for implementing the commission's recommendations did not measure their results in terms of building ghosts, but perhaps they should have. Ghosts are, after all, an indicator of development that favors removal over rehabilitation and replacement over reinvention. They rarely exist in cases of infill, where an empty lot is put back into use without extracting an equivalent building cost. Meanwhile, double ghosts are a demonstration of all the conditions that aligned to rationalize the demolition of what was likely an otherwise intact companionate structure. But a funny thing happens despite all this turnover. Some building ghosts are too persistent to be erased. They refuse to conform to the expectations of temporality in a changing city and are instead folded into the permanent streetscape as legacy ghosts. They insist on remaining on the sides of their neighboring buildings even after the risks of new construction and erasure have passed, at least for now. Building ghosts then reflect the same elasticity as the changing city around them. Some have a lifespan of just days, others we will be living alongside for years. A few millennia ago in ancient Greece, the philosopher Heraclitus mused, "No man ever steps in the same river twice, for it is not the same river and he's not the same man." The same can be said for our cities. Nowhere more so than the heart of Philadelphia, which metamorphoses every day for every person in it. In the context of such change then, are center cities building ghosts a symbol of the last city or the next one? So 2 stories in particular, 2 of the vignettes from Center City that I will share with you tonight before we break for questions. The first being 1025 Buttonwood Street, which was constructed sometime before 1860 and demolished in 2020. By the time she took lodgings at 1025 Buttonwood Street, 23-year-old Edith Fontini had already called Germany, France, Russia, and Venezuela home. If modern passports had existed then, hers would have had more stamps than this row house had rooms. Born in the town of Breslau, which was part of Prussia at the time and is now part of Poland by a different name, she studied in Leipzig and Paris, developing a love of languages. When an opportunity to work as a governess arose, Edith Fontini ventured to the city of Odessa, situated on the Black Sea and within Russian borders. At some point, with at least 3 languages on her tongue, she set out to learn a 4th. This one required a transoceanic crossing, as she set sail for Venezuela. She taught there until 1885, when she continued on to North America. Soon after, she landed in Philadelphia. During the many years Fontini was traveling the globe, this modest 2.5-story brick row house stood at 1025 Buttonwood Street. Located a block south of the grand Spring Garden Street, the block was lively in its own right, with an uninterrupted line of row houses on the north side and a school and police station on the south side, closer to 11th Street. It was also a convenient distance from the office at 10th and Market Streets, where Fontini found a job around the same time she began renting at number 1025 in 1888. She had journeyed more than 10,000 miles to earn a commute of just 7 blocks. A fluent multilinguist, Fontini secured a post as a stenographer for French Richards and Company, with responsibility for interpreting the company's foreign mail. Although French Richards was primarily a wholesale drug company selling legitimate pharmaceuticals alongside whiskey and bottled water to cure various ailments, it also advertised its robust trade in imported wares. The job kept Fontini busy, and she liked it, all the more so when she met Benjamin Franklin Hunter working there too. It was a shock then when the company suddenly announced in 1890 that it would shut down by the end of the year, after 46 years in business. Its founder had died suddenly, and the company had stumbled in his absence. Fontini lamented the announcement and helped draft a brief resolution in which the staff thanked the company and parted on good terms. A newspaper remarked, quote, "The relations between the employees and members of the firm had always been of the most pleasant character." Her years at French Richards were not an entire loss, however. In 1892, Fontini married Benjamin Hunter, A few years later, she gave birth to a daughter, Helen. By 1896, if not earlier, she was once again making use of her language skills, offering private instruction in French and German at a rate of 50 cents per lesson. It is unclear when Fontini moved out of 1025 Buttonwood Street. White women were only ever intermittently included in city directories, even when they had professions outside the home to list. Black women and men, meanwhile, were almost always relegated to separate directories altogether. She definitely lived there in 1888 and 1889, but her name does not appear at all in the city directories that follow. Nevertheless, she may have lived there until her marriage to Hunter in 1892, or perhaps she moved elsewhere in the city for a few years, around the time that French Richards was heading toward insolvency. By 1896, if not earlier, she lived in West Philadelphia. French Richards did not entirely fold in 1890. In the course of its liquidation, a segment of the company was sold off, merging with another outfit to become Smith, Kline and Company. Eventually, Fontini's company became part of what is now known as GlaxoSmithKline. Edith Fontini Hunter, meanwhile, left Philadelphia in the 1890s. Perhaps the wanderlust of her younger years returned, because after about 15 years in one place, she pulled up roots. Together with her husband and daughter, she once again called Paris home. This time, though, it was Paris, Tennessee. She died there in 1935. 1828 Rittenhouse Square, which perhaps you've walked past a million times and not clocked as a building ghost, but the building was built around 1856 and demolished around 1958. The ghost of 1828 Rittenhouse Square offers fewer traces than most, lingering only as an outline on the east elevation of 1830 Rittenhouse Square. A smooth stretch of stucco over the neighbor's otherwise brick wall, the ghost of number 1828 is accented only by its former chimneys. It reads rather like a blank canvas or perhaps an empty drafting board, if one were to read into it the lives of two of its most famous residents, the sculptor Catherine Cohen and the architect Edgar V. Sealer. Cohen lived there just before venturing to Paris for several years of study. Sealer lived there just after returning home from the City of Light. The row house at 1828 Rittenhouse Square, or 1828 Locust Street, as it was alternately known when they lived there, was the first of many creative homes for both the artist and the architect. Separated in their tenancies by only a decade, they each lived at number 1828 while attempting to launch their creative careers in the United States. Catherine Cohen's family moved into the 4-story brick building around 1866, about a decade after it was constructed overlooking Rittenhouse Square. Like so many of its row house cousins, the building had ample windows, each trimmed with stone lintels and sills on its north and south elevations. Its east and west elevations, meanwhile, bumped up against number 1826 and number 1830, the latter of which is, I'm going to describe the building preceding the building that's there now, was the 52-room mansion designed by Frank Furness and owned by Colonel Thomas A. Scott, vice president of the Pennsylvania Railroad. Born in 1859, Catherine Cohen was still young when the family moved in. She grew up with her 2 older sisters and 2 younger brothers. In her teenage years, she became interested in art and eventually enrolled in the School of Design for Women, now Moore College of Art and Design, and she later enrolled at the Pennsylvania Academy of Fine Arts. She studied under some of the finest artists of the day, including Thomas Eakins, Augustus Saint-Gaudens, and John J. Boyle. It was Boyle's specialization in sculpture that eventually became Cohen's as well. Cohen's family was deeply involved in the congregation of Mikveh Israel, and her Jewish faith found its way into her art career as she created busts of prominent Jewish Philadelphians and incorporated Jewish themes into her work. Her career was relatively unusual among her Jewish counterparts, since traditional interpretations of Jewish texts held that portraits and figural sculptures were forbidden as graven images. Catherine Cohen was first listed in Philadelphia city directories in 1884, the year she launched her own artistic studio. As capacious as this house at 1828 Rittenhouse Square was, it could not accommodate both her family and her studio. So she, together with a few artist friends, secured a large workroom on the 4th floor at 1334 Chestnut Street, situated above a publishing house on the lower floors. There, she could spread out her materials and studies with no siblings underfoot. Yet she chafed at the distance between her home on Rittenhouse Square and her studio on Chestnut Street. She maintained the arrangement for 4 years until she left around 1888 for further study in Paris. There, she got a taste of the many possibilities that Paris's built environment offered, which Philadelphia and so many other American cities did not. Affordable artist studios with living rooms attached. The proximity was a boon to her artistic life, and the experience lingered even after she left Paris. In 1893, she gave a high-profile speech about the issue in the Women's Building at the World's Columbian Exposition in Chicago. I'll quote a portion of that speech now. An artist's chief grief is that life is too short for him to accomplish what he wants to do, even in his own special line of work. And this is especially true of women, for talent knows no sex. There is another important consideration, and that is the lack here of studios with living rooms attached at moderate rents. An artist comes back here from Paris with very little ready money, for he has his way still to make. He has had there a studio with a fine light and all necessary fittings at a very moderate rent. What does he find when he comes here, say in New York or Boston or Philadelphia or San Francisco or Chicago? He must take his studio by the year, and it costs a small fortune at that, and there are scarcely any living rooms except in a very few instances. We hope that someone will recognize this need of the coming artists and put up studio buildings with small apartments or living rooms attached and let them at a moderate rent. End quote. Cohen lived a privileged life on Rittenhouse Square, brushing shoulders with high-powered neighbors and overlooking one of the city's toniest public spaces. Yet for all its significance in the years that launched her career, 1828 Rittenhouse Square ultimately laid bare the contrasts between her current creative setup and the artistic life she desired to lead. Upon her return from Paris, she left 1828 to find lodging elsewhere in the neighborhood. In the ensuing years, her home and studio addresses inched progressively closer, and yet, in Philadelphia at least, she apparently never managed to make them one and the same. The same year Cohen opened her studio, Edgar V. Sealer graduated from Central High School. By the time she gave her speech at the 1893 exposition, he had graduated from both the Pennsylvania Museum and School of Industrial Art and the Massachusetts Institute of Technology, and had studied for 4 years in an atelier at the École des Beaux-Arts in Paris. He returned to his hometown of Philadelphia in 1894, and he and his brother George, a bookkeeper, rented rooms or perhaps the entire house at 1828 Rittenhouse Square. That same year, Edgar Sealer launched his own practice, taking an office in Old City, even as he also commuted in the other direction to a new post as an assistant professor of architectural design at the University of Pennsylvania. His were longer commutes than Cohen's, but 1828 Rittenhouse Square was a relatively convenient midpoint between the geographic extremes of his working life. In his 2 years of living on Rittenhouse Square, Sealer secured the first commissions of what would be a productive and illustrious career. Among the earliest of his works was a building for Penn's dental school, now known as Hayden Hall, the construction of which overlapped perfectly with his time living here at number 1828. Fittingly enough, the building that Sealer designed at Penn would house the university's architecture program in the mid-20th century. Edgar and George Sealer moved out of 1828 Rittenhouse Square around 1896, and 2 years later, Edgar ended his teaching position at Penn. He would go on to design prominent commercial commissions for the Curtis Publishing Company, Penn Mutual Life Insurance, and the Philadelphia Bulletin, as well as several residential and institutional projects. In some ways, then, 1828 Rittenhouse Square was for him the building that launched scores of buildings. In the decades after the Sealers moved out, development leapfrogged back and forth on both sides of Rittenhouse Square. As many of its neighbors were replaced by modernist newcomers, number 1828 increasingly looked like a remnant from another century, because it was. In 1913, a 17-story tower with 40 luxury apartments replaced the Scott family mansion to the west and loomed over the 4-story row house at 1828 Rittenhouse Square. Meanwhile, other new apartment buildings went up at the east end of the block at the mid-century mark, creeping closer to number 1828. Finally, around 1958, development pressures grew too strong, and 1828 Rittenhouse Square was torn down to make way for an apartment building that took another decade to materialize. The demolished building did not disappear without a trace, however. It left behind a building ghost on the tower at 1830 Rittenhouse Square, as if the older structure at number 1828 insisted on pulling rank on its more fashionable new neighbor. The building ghost's presence is subtly felt, receding into the cityscape as a stucco imprint that frames a nondescript driveway where the house used to be. Yet, in the years that it was present, 1828 Rittenhouse Square cultivated two of Philadelphia's most renowned artisans, lending itself to the accumulated creativity of the city. By way of a coda for our conversation today, puncturing the urban fabric and giving us pause, building ghosts offer evidence of patterns that are neither accidental nor incidental. They somehow manage to remind us of a structure's disposability and its permanence, speaking in the same breath to a city's development and its destruction. Such dynamism is essential to the understanding of Philadelphia and any other city. The stories and lives exerted in this book would not exist without it. Marking and mourning the presence of building ghosts, then, is not about stopping time or halting change. These ghosts are proof of the very futility of such an endeavor. In the end, building ghosts are an insistence that these places are not blank slates or empty canvases. What place is? They are fragments that will simply be folded into the kaleidoscopic city around them, a century in the future, a year away, or an hour from now. Thank you all.
Thank you so much. That was incredible and beautiful and thought-provoking. And so I would love to invite anybody in the room. If you have a question, I will bring you the mic. I think we have a few on Zoom that we can share as well.
Thank you. That was really very interesting. I wonder if you could, with this photograph that's on the screen right now, could you take a minute to interpret the ghost for us, what the various marks mean and what they tell us about how they were constructed?
Absolutely. And in the book, there is a photo montage that diagrams a lot of the things that you do often see in building ghosts. Physically, I wonder where is the best place to do it. I wonder if I can point to things on the screen or what. But recurring elements of these building ghosts usually begin with the structural joist pockets, which is where the joists would hook into the brick wall, the masonry walls. So when you see, it's less evident on this particular ghost, but when you see a pattern of pockets, but open holes between floors, that's where the joists would have gone in. And so that's an indicator of the structure. We are seeing the outline of where the stairs were leading from the first to the second floors and from the second to the third floors, the angled lines where the brick is coming through between the plaster. All the white areas on this ghost are plaster walls that would have been on the interior of this space. You know, each room would have been one of these outlines of plaster. The other thing I'll highlight, I'm going to go off stage here just to point for those in the room, but that this tile fragment is a foyer. So you would have come into this house, had a brief moment in a foyer where this was a decorative thing on the wall, and then this is the transition into the rest of the living space before you get to the stairs, et cetera. So that's a level of detail that isn't on every building ghost, but is an extra accent that we see in this particular ghost. And then one other thing that I'll flag that shows up often, and I'm tall, but not this tall. On the third floor, at the far right of the wall, you can see the larger rectangle and then the smaller rectangle of plaster. That to me indicates a closet, because you're seeing the, you know, open hanging space, let's say, and then a shelf above where that little line cuts through. So that's another element you can often read into ghosts, is when you see closets show up. But these are the joist pockets that I was talking about. On this particular ghost, a lot of them have been filled in kind of on a very crude basis with concrete or whatever, but they are often still exposed, and you can tell where the structure would have hooked in that way. Some ghosts also, you can see the flue from the chimney, et cetera, et cetera. So in the book, there is a diagram where an artist made a composite of things that show up across a lot of ghosts in order to diagram these features for folks.
Thank you. That was an excellent visual description, and folks saw it on Zoom as well. We moved the camera. Another question is, this is a great question. Are any of the ghosts in your book older than the late 1800s?
As in the buildings were older?
Yes.
Yes. It gets trickier. There's at least one building that I suspect is 18th century, goes back into the 1700s. But the challenge, this is where it was a challenge to be a historian researching something that's no longer there as a reference point, is at what point do I lose confidence that what I'm seeing in a map, for instance, is the same footprint as a later map? So yes, there are buildings in the book that I think are that old, but the further it goes back where I don't have a point of comparison, for instance, there's no building where I can guess at the era of style, et cetera, then I was cautious to make too many assumptions. And that was kind of something I hadn't really anticipated as being a level of difficulty for this particular type of research.
Anything else in the room?
Thank you so much for this talk. This was fascinating. This is fascinating. I'm curious, sort of piggybacking on both of the previous questions, how much you can tell about what it was like to live in these houses? Like what can the ghosts tell you much about where people were living and how they were living in those spaces? And I'm asking in part because I was in an 18th century Philadelphia house once, and it's in Society Hill, and they have a wonderful picture of it where in the 50s it had a glass front, and now it looks all colonial again because it was redone to look like somebody's image in the 20th century, what the 18th century house might have looked like, but it had been lived in all this time and was all crazy. But the second floor was original and had this original woodwork inside, and you could see sort of this was the place that you retired to in the 18th century, that you went upstairs to this space, and that is where you hung out and sat and had lovely spaces. And again, this was like a dinette in the 50s. It had this whole long history. Can you tell anything about where people were living, how they were living? You can see the closet in this particular image, but what can you tell us about how people were using these spaces, if at all, and how that changes in the era of the building, either when it was built or demolished?
It's a great question. And here again, there's things I feel confident speculating on and things that I tread carefully on. At the simplest level, the fact that there is that tile detail, for instance, that I flagged in the foyer, that level of ornamentation doesn't show up across all buildings or all building ghosts. You know, this is clearly, and you can tell from the remaining buildings in the row that this was a higher level of design, a higher level of wealth built this and then probably lived in it at least until the neighborhood kept turning over to be other demographics. So that's a certain element of how people live. And when you get to the upper floors, you don't see that level of detail because those are more private spaces where they're not putting on the show, let's say. I think one other thing that came through was how often the number of people associated with a house, I'm going to stick with the residential ones. There are a few institutional ones in the book, but largely because of this building, you know, because of the patterns that create building ghosts, we are often talking about residential buildings. So to focus on those, the number of people that are in city directories associated with an address or in censuses associated with an address is just, on the whole, probably more than we would expect there to be in an equivalent house there today. So, you know, servants, or even just larger families, et cetera. So that was another element about how people lived in these places that really came through in the research is, you know, just packing more people into each of these houses than we would think. And then the one other piece of it that this did require a little bit of speculation, but for instance, I remember this is a vignette in the book. This is a house that has a full vignette in the book. And I remember that it had a doctor living in it at one point and using it for his practice. And there I have to speculate, but I'm assuming that the front room they gave over to him. He was one of the renters, and that the front room was his to use as an office, and that they then, the rest of the tenants and owners just kind of retreated to other spaces within the house. So there, when you have like an explicitly public use inserted into one of these places, you can kind of draw some conclusions about public and private spaces within each of these.
Thank you. We have a similar follow-up, I think, online from Paul, asking more about what the ghosts tell you about building structures, how they built the houses over time. So you referenced the tile foyer area. Were there construction techniques that you saw differences in the decades that you were looking at that the ghosts told you?
Yeah, and by the way, I'll
Maybe materials?
add again, speaking to patterns, development patterns, I was often finding that, the ghost I'm interested in was part of an entire block built at the same time by one builder, and that builder might be responsible for lots of blocks in that area, including other ghosts that I was also researching. Like there were some places in North Philly where they are geographically close to each other, but you wouldn't know today that they share a common origin story of the same builder and the same development shift from open farm to dense residential neighborhood. So that as a pattern showed up. I do think in terms of if the question was getting at style, things like that, I think especially for 19th century architecture, there's distinctive aspects of these buildings, such as these arches that are, very specific here and distinctive in a way that doesn't show up everywhere. But structurally, in terms of how these buildings are getting built and even the layouts of the interior were pretty consistent. I mean, we've all been in all these row houses. We know that a lot of them share the same floor plan, and that was the asset of row house development, was that they were so replicable. So that was part of the point, was you didn't need to reinvent the design every time. There was one ghost where I found part of the original building records, the developers, who were just builders, not formal trained architects, but they were builders, and they were hiring somebody to build stairs in 190 houses. That was the number in the ad where they are placing the ad. So they're not looking to create, custom homes for individual people. The point was, how can we get as many of these built as quickly as we can? And so you can get a sense of the scale based on that kind of replication.
I think we have time for two more questions.
I'm curious, you mentioned that you found few, if any, ghosts in areas like northeast and northwest Philadelphia. Were you able to draw any conclusions or theories as to why?
Sure was. And the essay for Northwest and Northeast, which is a joint essay because so few show up, to remind ourselves of the map here, for the city. Like I said, we did get to those parts of the city. It's demonstration that there weren't ghosts really in that area. And I think Northeast and Northwest have different factors as to why. If we think about ghosts, a number of factors need to converge to create a building ghost. Geographic factors, physical factors, economic factors. And I think in many ways, Northeast and Northwest kind of have inverse factors, which is Northwest has the older, the age of the building stock would seem to suggest building ghosts could be created. These are old enough buildings equivalent to other parts of the city where people are turning them over for new construction because they are seen as, outdated or obsolete or whatever. So the age of the building stock in Northwest would seem to lend itself to building ghosts, but that is not a denser part of the city. Most of the areas of Northwest Philly, buildings have, space between them, green space between them. And so if one building comes down, you don't get the resulting building ghost there. Northeast, I think, is the inverse, where a lot of communities in the Northeast are built densely, a lot of post-war housing, but they, leaving aside areas like Frankfurt that are obviously old, most of the Northeast is newer, built in the 20th century, and hasn't necessarily been seen to age out of its useful life yet. And so it hasn't turned over to create building ghosts. So I think there's kind of mirror images or inverse factors in those two areas that speak to each other. And then a third layer that I think is true for like Oak Lane, East Oak Lane area and other parts of the city are the concept of middle neighborhoods, which I don't know if people in this room or on Zoom are familiar with that, but that is a term that's been coined to speak to neighborhoods that are not seeing the development pressures of a center city, for instance, or the river wards or whatever, but also not seeing the level of disinvestment and, displacement, et cetera, that North Philly has seen a lot of. They are just kind of middle neighborhoods exist somewhere in between. They're not experiencing either extreme of pressure. And I think a lot of middle neighborhoods in Philadelphia exist where you don't see building ghosts. And so there isn't the churn that would create building ghosts. So I think it's a convergence of all of those things in those areas.
I have a question for Mr. Bixler. Is it you mentioned that when you were taking pictures, that photographs, that you occasionally got into conversation with people who were watching. I'm curious, sort of, what their response was. Did they have any observations on the process that was creating these ghosts?
Sure. So usually I would approach them at first to disarm them, because what I'm doing is basically taking a picture of their house. And that's can be invasive and somewhat threatening, because real estate developers and lots of cities, but especially Philadelphia, send people out, scouts out, to look for properties to buy, demolish, this, that, and the other. And from experience with Hidden City and being, as well as the editor, the photographer, I've had experiences where people have mistaken me for a scout, and we've, come close to an altercation, at least some strong words. And even though I explain myself, things don't get cleared up. So I would, approach them to disarm them, let them know that I'm working on a history project and that, their house is beautiful. But this is why, and I would tell them, this is why I'm taking a picture of this empty lot, because if you see these little lines and stuff, it's where a building used to be. And that usually would hook them, especially if there's a family out and there's kids and stuff. It's kind of educational. And I would also ask them, do you remember the house that was here? Do you remember the people who lived here? In some occasions, they would remember actually the people. A lot of times, though, they'd say the house was derelict and they were glad it was gone. But generally, there was a lot of enthusiasm. And as you kind of, as I unpacked just a little bit generally of what the project was about, they were excited. That last photograph, actually, with the ornate arch front, there was a family that was sitting there. It was like 7 to 8 people, and everybody got way into it. I was like on a timeline trying, we only had 4 months, and I was like, but I sat there for probably about 30 or 45 minutes, like talking to them about the whole project and everything. Everybody's really excited. They're going to their phones and going on Instagram and liking Building Ghosts account and stuff. So generally really good interactions.
Thank you all so much. This was a wonderful presentation. Let's show our praise and gratitude once more. For the room, we have books on sale here. For those on Zoom, we'll be sending a link to purchase the book through Temple Press in our follow-up email. Also, for those in the room right now, make sure you follow us. We are at Historical PA. You are at Building Ghosts. We put it in the chat, so you'll Bixler on social media. Sign up for our newsletter if you don't already, hsp.org/enews, and we hope to see you here at 13th and Locust, researching your own community and your own buildings. Thanks again so much. Have a great night.